I'm a few minutes early, so I'm just hanging out here. Um, if for some reason you happen to be viewing this on YouTube, I can't tell that you're there, so go find it on Google and use the Q&A to ask questions. Hi, how are you, Remy? If you have a question, please feel free to ask it. It's not very good at telling me when people are here. So anyhow, I'm here to talk about Phoenix Dawn Command, the role-playing game which I'm currently starting on Kickstarter now. And I would love to know if people would like to hear more about the setting, more about the system, or anything I can tell you about. I'll wait a moment or two more to see if you guys have questions. Otherwise, I'm just going to randomly start burbling, which is the thing I do. Hi, Remy. So, Phoenix Dawn Command is a card-based role-playing game. It is, to be clear, a role-playing game. You have a game master telling a story, working with a group of people. So cards are used to resolve actions in place of dice, but it is not a card game, if you will. It is where you use the cards to accomplish your actions. Again, if folks have specific questions, please use the Q&A button to submit questions so I know what you want to know about. Okay, well, I'll just keep going then. Thanks, Remy. So, as I said, it is set in a world that basically, looking back and comparing to Eberron, if people are familiar with Eberron, it is a fantasy world, a world in which magic exists, but a world in which magic is dangerous and mysterious and has largely been suppressed for the last couple of 100 years. And then essentially the first Phoenixes being the supernatural champions who can come back from death stronger than before, united all the known nations into one empire. And again, stopped people using magic and things like that. Eventually, people actually rose up against the Phoenixes because they didn't like being ruled by immortal, superhumans. And after the Civil War, the Phoenixes stepped down and basically stopped coming back. And so we had about a couple of hundred years where there were no Phoenixes, but things were very peaceful. Then basically just over the last couple of years, everything has started going to heck. The dead are rising, we have hauntings, we have strange beasts in the woods, we have shape changers, all these threats that are happening all over. We don't know why, we don't know how they're related. We just know that frankly we can't handle them and they're getting worse, and we collectively refer to this as the dread. But a big part of the game is not knowing, is trying to find out. It's not just about beating up some monsters, it's can you understand what they are and where they are coming from. Again, if anyone has specific questions, please use the Q&A button to let me know what you'd like to know about. In any case, so within the world, we have all these issues. We have an army of the dead that has risen up in the south and is just marching north, and no one's figured out how to stop it. But we also have things like the chant that just starts in cities and spreads, and everyone who hears it starts killing one another. And we've just, again, we don't know if these two things are related. We don't know what to do. We just don't know, can't stop them until we start having phoenixes return. And that's where you come in. Phoenixes are people who die and then return from death charged with supernatural power. And as a phoenix, you have certain abilities based on what type of phoenix you are. And each time you die, you return again stronger than before, but you only get to return 7 times. You also don't return at the place that you died, and you don't return right away. So part of the point is most of the time what's going on, the missions have very high stakes. They're very time sensitive. So, a lot of people say, well, why don't I just kill myself? I'll get more powerful. And it's because usually we can't afford to waste a life. You need to do as much as possible, and the odds are likely going to be against you, and you will. Sooner or later, people are going to have to make sacrifices, but it's not something you want to do just casually. Any more specific questions, anyone? Continuing. So within the world itself, just talking a little bit more about the world, if I'd been smart, I would have brought a map with me. I am going to discuss it further on my website. One of the points is certainly compared to a setting like Eberron, Phoenix does have a driving story. We do have the fact that our world is facing destruction at the hands of the Dread. Within that, though, there is a deeper story. There is this question of, well, there's more to the Dread than we understand. It's not just a plague of monsters. What is it? How do these different things relate to each other? Are they even all connected? Or are there more going on here than we know? Aha. Okay, so we've got a couple of good questions in here. So first is the question of if phoenixes are like demigods, and that's a pretty good way to look at them. This is a setting where we don't have sort of incarnate gods the way we do in Dungeons and Dragons, but the phoenixes are indeed people who have died. When you die, you go into this realm called the Crucible, where you undergo trials to sort of earn the power of a phoenix. And so when you return, it's exactly that. You are people who are these sort of superhuman champions within the world. Now, the next point, though, is you assume we have evil phoenixes that use their power selfishly. And the answer is no, we generally don't. Because the whole point is being a phoenix isn't something that just happens. It's something you have to earn. You have to, you are essentially chosen. You can almost look to it a little as a Valkyrie sort of situation. You have to be a remarkable person who dies a remarkable death, and then you are essentially chosen to have a chance to prove yourself worthy to be a phoenix. So this is the sort of point of people say, how do we force the phoenixes, if they're so powerful, to to fight for the empire? And we're saying you wouldn't be chosen if you wouldn't fight to protect the innocent. It's up to you to decide why you fight. And there's lots of possible stories. You could just want to protect the innocent. You could say, I'm putting this all back together because I want the phoenixes to take over again, and I want to rule the new empire. You could just be trying to protect your family, or your descendants or your homeland. So, there's lots of reasons to be a phoenix, but you're not gonna be a phoenix unless you're willing to protect people. With that said, given the Dread, there's any number of horrible supernatural evil threats out there. So evil phoenixes are not, sort of necessary for the setting. Also, with that said, phoenixes have the best of intentions, but as I pointed out, we had a civil war when people didn't want to be ruled by phoenixes. Just because phoenixes aren't necessarily evil doesn't always mean it's going to be clear-cut good and bad, and that there won't be people who disapprove of their actions, distrust them. Certainly when the game begins, you are not part of the Imperial Army or anything like that. Phoenixes are legends that are just starting to come back, and people are still trying to figure out how to deal with them, what they want to do. Now, second question is, can a returned phoenix take on another aspect, like a bitter one after several returns devoted? Absolutely. The way it works is that when you die, we basically look at it and say, what kind of death was that? Why did you die? Each school is tied to a certain kind of death. So bidders, for example, died in failure. And they're about taking vengeance. Durants are about dying because you're not tough enough. And so the answer is you become tougher. It affects the kind of lessons that you learn in your next life. With that said, your first death, the one you deal with when you make your character, is the most significant and is the one that gives you sort of the most defining core abilities. So in other words, a devoted phoenix is someone who died sort of for others. They sacrifice themselves for others, and their core abilities are about strengthening, healing, and working with others. If they then have a horrible failure, brutally bitter death, their next set of lessons will be bitter lessons, but we'll still call them a devoted phoenix because they still have those core devoted lessons that no one else can end up getting. So you can have a devoted phoenix who has 2 bitter deaths, an elemental death, and a forceful death, but you've still got this unique set of devoted traits that no one else can get. Any more questions? Those were all good ones. While I'm waiting for more questions, just going back to the scenario. So as I said, what you basically have here is this empire to which phoenixes are basically legends. We all know the stories of them, but of course in some of the stories they were tyrannical rulers, and so we're not even people who believe in phoenixes are not necessarily going to trust them. And so when the story begins, there's only about 90 phoenixes in the world, and you're really more, I like to sort of compare it to sort of the resistance movement in Terminator. You're sort of putting things together, you have limited supplies and resources, and part of how the game will go is determining how do you relate to the Empire. How do you earn their trust? Do you end up sort of leading the armies and things like that? Or do you end up sort of working entirely on your own as this sort of rogue force trying to solve problems your way? This is also very much where the game sort of evolves long term, is in this first act that we're dealing with. And the game comes with 7 missions, but also with lots of guidance for making your own. The first act is basically, we don't understand the dread, and we can fight these things, but again, without understanding them, we don't know how to stop them from continuing and expanding. We can't win a war if we don't actually understand the enemy. So the first act is very much about trying to sort of figure out what is going on, and at the same time to establish yourself as returned phoenixes, within the Empire and the relationship there. And as you move on to the second act, you would have much more sort of room for what is going to be the role of phoenixes. Should phoenixes try and take over again because the world apparently needs them? Where do you stand on questions like that? And so there's room for a lot more sort of intrigue and politics. But as the story opens, it's very much a question of survival and just trying to protect people from all the terrible things that are going on. Any questions, anyone? We've got the Q&A button if you have anything you'd specifically like me to talk about. Again, I can get more into the story. I could talk about the different schools of phoenixes, or I could talk about the mechanics of the game. I will note that there's a pair of good videos up right now on YouTube by Rich Milena. One is called Character Creation in Phoenix Dawn Command, and one is called Skill Spreads in Phoenix Dawn Command. And both of these are very good, just sort of walkthroughs of our current mechanics. Excellent question. So when I say there's no evil phoenixes, what I mean is when the story opens, the world is facing this terrible supernatural threat. And what we're saying is you're never going to get a phoenix who's going to come back and say, that's not my problem. I'd rather go get some ice cream or get a big pile of gold. You know, a phoenix is going to have to be willing to fight to protect things. However, where the previous phoenixes were tyrants, and again, this is a point they would argue with, but where it led to a civil war was because they basically came in and said, we know what we need to do to protect the world. You know, we are going to unite people. We're going to stop them using magic because magic is dangerous. And we are going to create essentially a society that is safe and well ordered. And the point is, they had the best of intentions. They were making, in their opinion, a better world, but common people didn't really care for having these demigods running around essentially telling them what to do. And so that's where it became a question of freedom. Thus you have the Civil War, and ultimately ending with the leaders of the Phoenix is actually saying, you're right. You know, we have gone too far. It's not our role to rule, it's our role to defend. And so they actually stepped down. So what I'm saying here is you have to be willing to fight the dread to be a phoenix. But within that, you can have any range of motivation you want, whether it's, you know, you want, basically if you're not willing to protect people, you won't come back, but you could protect the people because you want to restore the old empire, or you could protect them because you want to create an entirely new, more peaceful society. And basically that's the point, is not all phoenixes agree on everything, but they do agree on the basic, we've got to keep the world from being destroyed. Again, if any of you have played Eberron, you know, it's an extension of that sort of concept that good and evil aren't absolutes, you know, that most people perceive their actions as good, even if others might perceive them as evil. As I said, with phoenixes, what you aren't going to get is entirely selfish, I'm not even willing to help, you know, but why you're willing to help and how others will perceive your help is a big question. And again, this comes to the whole, how do you interact? Do you approach the empire and essentially say, let's work together, let's be friends, how can we help? Or do you basically say, we know what we're doing, you can't handle this, we can get out of our way? And that's something that will, you know, again, come across as more of that tyrannical, we're the people with the power who can get things done. Did that address the point, or do you have further questions? And meanwhile, we do have, you know, still another 15 minutes here. So again, if anyone has any specific questions, or if, you know, there's anything you're curious about, as I said, I'm happy to talk more about the world, about the system, or, you know, my favorite types of cookies, because I like cookies, just saying. Going back while I'm waiting for more questions to again talk about creating characters. So there is the video that is character creation in Phoenix Dawn Command that you should certainly take a look at. One of the points about it is that basically, oh, here we go. All right. So the question is basically, do we have the point that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic? And specifically calling out the canon on the bone chariot that you see. And it is the point that Phoenix is, at its base, it is a fantasy setting. And we sort of put the level of technology essentially somewhat between the height of the Roman Empire and the early Renaissance. So we do have some advances like printing presses and things like that, but the fastest way to get somewhere is still riding a horse, and you know, most people are still using swords and things like that on the battlefield. Now, with that specific element, the chariot with the cannon, what that is a weapon from the Civil War. And this was a time when people were fighting phoenixes and coming up with weapons that mortals could use to fight phoenixes, you know, trying to find ways to turn the tide. And so they did come up with essentially what that device there is a flamethrower. And they did come up with, you know, again, it's the idea of more sort of Greek fire, you know, things like that. But they did develop explosives flamethrowers and such. And part of the idea was that when the Phoenixes essentially surrendered, when they stepped down and said, we'll give up our power, but you guys have to start making those, making weapons of mass destruction. The sort of bargain is we'll become the defenders. And, the reason they stepped down is because of the horrific damage that was being done. But now what you have is the corpses of the soldiers for the legions from the Civil War sort of rising up, and they're still using those weapons. So the point of that chariot is it is actually essentially a technological device that just hasn't been used for a couple hundred years. With that said, Phoenixes themselves often have unique weapons that are magical called talons. But certainly in comparison to Eberron, which very much is a magic used as technology setting, in Phoenix, it's that magic, as I said, exists but has largely been suppressed. So right now we're still finding out sort of exactly what can it do. And there are sort of hints of a much older civilization which really did have that level of magic, where, again, it was so advanced that it would seem like technology to us. Anyhow, good question, and glad to see that the tyranny point made sense. Any more? What else do we want to talk about? As I was saying, normally when you make a Phoenix, you talk about sort of who were you in your first life, how did you die, and why do you come back? These are all the things the stories you have to answer to create your characters. What is it you're fighting for? What did you lose to the Dread, and why are you back? Now, the whole point is that in the Crucible, time has no real meaning, and so you could have been in there essentially having a training montage for what felt to you like decades, even if to the rest of the world you were only dead for a week. So part of it is you really could be anyone in your first life. You could be a child, you could be a school teacher, you could have been a soldier, but through the course of the Crucible, you will come back as an incredible, demigod. Okay. So here's the thing. When Phoenixes die, when they die their first death, they don't know they're going to return. No one knows, you're not a Phoenix until you die and are chosen to have the chance to become a Phoenix. So it is exactly that idea of, the martyr, and, being a martyr could be, you got, again, maligned and crucified or what have you. Or it could also be, I died because I ran into a burning building to rescue children and saved them, but died because of my wounds. If you didn't save them, that would be kind of bitter death. If you did save them, but died, that would be a devoted death because I died protecting others. Now, once you do become a Phoenix, Phoenixes do know that it's possible for them to return 7 times. So that's sort of common knowledge. No Phoenix has ever returned more than 7 times. However, it's not an assured thing. Basically, each time you die, you go back to the Crucible and you have to sort of fight your way through it all over again. So from a mechanical standpoint, as a player, you do know you're going to get 7 lives, but each time I'm going to ask you, what is it that gives you the strength to return? What is it you're fighting for this time? It wasn't sort of a free trip. You had to struggle to get back again. And again, it's always that question of what is making it worth it to you to come back and get back into this fight. Certainly within the game itself, most Phoenixes, you are given missions. We know that there's a chant outbreak in this city. Get in there and stop it and try and contain it before it spreads and consumes the entire city. And so most of the time, one of the things about Phoenix is the odds can be very much stacked against you. Is if I'm writing an adventure for Dungeons and Dragons, I'm going to make it pretty fair. I'm going to make it, at least 50-50 that things are fair. In Phoenix, that's not necessarily the case. You know, to me, it's very much like Lord of the Rings, where you go into the Mines of Moria and you fight some orcs, and that's okay. You can handle orcs, but when you run into that Balrog, it's now just a question of, can you get out alive? In Phoenix, the important thing about that would be discovering there's a Balrog here, you know, which would be the kind of information we need to know. So the question is, do phoenixes return with full memories of past lives or cloudy deja vu sort of memories? As it stands, they were, you know, there's basically two answers to that. The default is they return with their memories of their past lives, because again, you're literally dying between adventures. You know, you're going to die at the end of the adventure and you're going to come back and we're not going to say, oh, you don't really remember what happened last adventure. At the same time, because time doesn't really have any meaning in the Crucible, lots of time can technically pass or very little. So one of the backgrounds we suggest is you could have a guy who, for example, died hundreds of years ago in the context of the story of the world and has only just come back. So, you know, it's posted on my website, keith-baker.com. We have a guy who is basically a barbarian chieftain who fought the Phoenixes when they were originally establishing the empire and has now come back hundreds of years later as a Phoenix himself. Beyond that, because you define your story, the idea of a character who doesn't remember, you know, who is in the Crucible for who knows how long and literally can't remember his first life, I think that's a great idea for a story. And as a game master, I would want to put in little clues or have it become relevant over the course of the game. So in other words, that's not the default, but it is absolutely a story that a player could have, and one that I think would be very interesting. It's also the case that with the Shrouded Phoenixes, which are one of the particular schools of Phoenixes, one of the aspects of their power, their whole thing is about being secret and uncovering secrets. And one of the ideas of the Shrouded Phoenix is they basically get erased from history. So no one remembers them. People have a hard time even remembering what they do in this life. So if you had a Shrouded Phoenix who couldn't remember his own life, and you know the world has sort of wiped the traces away, you could definitely have an interesting mystery of trying to actually discover, well, who was he in his original life? Like I said, Phoenix has this sort of core driving story that is protect the world from the dread, but there's a lot of possibilities for sort of more intrigue, deeper stories that, you know, go beyond that, if that's something your group wants to explore. We probably have time for one more question, if we have one more. And I keep pulling the cord out of my computer because I do that. Other than that, the Phoenix is up on Kickstarter right now. I'm going to be posting more updates about the world on my website, which is keith-baker.com. And so I'll probably be putting up a map and more discussion about the different sort of nations and such over the next couple of days. Other than that, we're very close to our goal, at which point we'll start getting into our stretch goals. And that's about it for me. As I said, I could probably do one more question if we have. Here we go. Yes. Okay, so again, normally what happens is basically the soonest a Phoenix can return is dawn the day after your death. The game master can basically institute because of the nature of your death, because of how difficult it was, or because of the thing that destroyed you, you know, if you're fighting some weird magical entity, they can make it take longer. But as a rule, you could come back the next day. It's simply that for you, it may have been months or days, you know, or years that you spent in the Crucible. Now, in terms of backstory, so, hey, I'm playing that barbarian chieftain who was in the Crucible for hundreds of years, and you're playing some farmer who died yesterday. How is it that we return at the same time? Part of that is, again, the idea that this is a particularly significant time. It is also the case that phoenixes are bound together in groups called wings, where basically a phoenix of each school is sort of connected in a unit. So you're not sort of just randomly assigned to the group of phoenixes that you end up working with, to your party. You're actually mystically connected to them. And so to a certain degree, why did you all happen to come back at this time? We're essentially saying this is a certain amount of destiny at work. You know, this is the time that the four of you came back, and now we're sending you out to do things. But basically, when you die, you do generally come back within a couple of days, and it's mainly within the course of a specific mission. Some missions can be you're trying to break a siege or something like that, and within that kind of mission, you would have time to return from a death within the context of that adventure. But for the most part, it's much more common that, you know, a mission is going to be, you've got 8 hours to do this thing. And so if you die, even though you're going to come back, you won't be able to come back in the course of the mission. And so you don't want to die casually. Thank you very much. I'm really glad you could be here. Thanks so much for the questions. They were all really good. And I'm going to sign off now, but thank you everyone for listening. Take care.